Okay, good evening everyone. Well, I think we gave most people a chance. I'm sure there's still a few coming up, but they'll make their way. You're very welcome here. We're very glad to have so many people who have come. My name is Nina Lopez. I'm from Legal Action for Women and also from the Global Women's Strike. And Legal Action for Women coordinates the Support Non-Separation Coalition, whose banner you see here at the back. Before we start, I would like to ask people not to take photos or to film. We have somebody filming, so the stuff will be made available. But, you know, because we're discussing children and people's cases and all that, yeah, Crystal is a photographer. And Nikki, who's not here, but will be here shortly. So there will be some photos taken, but we just want to make sure that if there's sensitive information, it doesn't get out there in the world. Now, the purpose of this meeting, as you've seen from the leaflet, I hope everybody has one, is to gather and present evidence of the harm caused by children by social services, by the authorities taking children away, ignoring the trauma that the separation from their mother causes them, and in fact inflicting more harm than those children would have gone through if they hadn't been separated. There is very little recognition of that, and we intend to change it so that we can actually change the situation for children and for families. Now, because there's so many of us, and because time is always limited, we're not going to be able to go through everybody's experience who is here. I'm sure many of you have your own experience of the battles you have made to keep your children or to get them back, and I hope that many of you have won. And some of us have won and some of us have lost, but we are determined to change the situation so that none of us lose anymore, and so that our children especially don't lose. So we have a form. We ask people that when they've heard all the speakers to please keep your questions and comments brief, and we have some forms at the back for people to actually leave more information about your cases, which we would love to have, and you can do it anonymously or you can put your name as you wish, but it's very important information that we hope to use in our campaigning and also to stay in touch with you. Now, just to say briefly where we stand as a coalition, the law doesn't recognize the primary relationship between mother and child. It treats the child as some kind of independent person who more or less comes out of a cardboard box, becomes this legal entity, and therefore the welfare of the child becomes a primary concern, so they say, but without real recognition that the child is dependent on the mother, and that in order for the child to have well-being and happiness, the child needs the mother. And I do say the mother because in the age of equality, where everything has become gender neutral, all of a sudden it doesn't really matter whether it's the mother, the father, the corporate parent, whoever it is, somehow somebody is going to take care of this child. Well, life is not like that. And the fact is that until recently, it was assumed, and I think every civilization has assumed, that a child needs, first of all, a mother. Now, it's not always a mother. There are other primary carers, and of course we very much recognize that, and we work very closely with the Scottish primary carers, kinship carers, who are fighting for recognition, including financial recognition. Also, there's very little recognition of the fact that in many court cases, the father is actually violent. And there will be more said about that, which is another reason why you can't just be gender neutral and equate everybody and put us all in the same bag. Now, in the age of women's liberation, and of course we are all in favor of being liberated and of not being stuck in a position where a woman is just supposed to be a mother and that is her role in society and nothing else. In that age, somehow, to be identified as a mother has become unfashionable. It's something that's looked down on. It's something that's no longer recognized, despite the fact that mothers are fighting for their children every day. There are tens of thousands of mothers out there, and we meet them on our picket every month, who are absolutely desperate because of what has happened to their children and because of the worry about how their children are managing. We don't want anybody's liberation to be at the expense of children, at the expense of anybody else. It cannot be like that, and we stand against it. There was, the people like Bowlby, people like Oliver James, people like Sue Gerhardt, who have spoken and written and researched about the fundamental importance of the relationship between mother and child, have been attacked, because somehow that doesn't go together with women going out to work and prioritizing their careers over family life. Now, if you ask the majority of women, and Mumsnet and others have done that, and you ask mothers with young children, what do they want? You will find out that the majority do not want to be working full-time, because the majority do want to have more time for their children. Now, that is a reality which is not acknowledged and which we want to put on the agenda. Because our happiness depends on it, the health of our children depend on it, and we as a society depend on it. If you downgrade the relationship between children and mothers, then you leave children in a very vulnerable position. And that is what we are trying to get the evidence for, so that it is taken into consideration when people are fighting their cases, and hopefully many, many less cases end up of children being taken away and families having to go to court. Now, the other issue that we'll be speaking about is the issue of poverty and social engineering, because it is largely poor families that are being targeted. It is largely single mothers, it is largely women who come into contact with social services because they're on benefits or something that has happened along the way where maybe they needed support and instead they got their children taken away. Also, mental health. There's a lot of talk about mental health, and nobody looks at the connection between mental health and what has happened to children, and whether they've been taken from their families, whether they've ended up in care, whether they've been forced to be in contact with violent fathers. What is at the root of the mental health that we can now stop? Instead, we create another industry of professionals to deal with mental health, but the root causes are not addressed. Now, we are here not to make careers, not to promote research for the sake of it. We are here to get whatever evidence we need in order to make our case stronger, our campaigning stronger, to enable people to fight their corner and to win their cases, and to stop this horrendous situation where tens of thousands of children are being unjustly taken from their mothers and their families and their grandmothers, and sometimes fathers too, are being taken from their families, and many of them put up for adoption against the will of the birth family. I think the UK and the US are the only countries that use adoption, forced adoption, in the ways that they do. Some of it is going on in Europe, but it's nothing on this scale, absolutely nothing on this scale. And when people come here from abroad, they're absolutely astonished at what's going on. So we want to deal with that as well. I want to say that Jean Robertson-Molloy from the Movement for Adoption Apology is here, who's part of the coalition, and that she will hopefully say something from the floor afterwards, because they are fighting to get an apology for the forced adoptions of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And there's been some acknowledgement about that, but there's been no acknowledgement of the fact that forced adoptions are still going on in their thousands and have become, in fact, a private industry. And we want that stopped. So without further ado, I'm going to start with my first speaker, who is Anne Neal from Legal Action for Women, co-author of our dossier, Suffer the Little Children and Their Mothers, and she will be talking about the updated findings for the past 18 months.
Thanks, Nina. So, Legal Action for Women started in 1982. It's based at the Crossroads Women's Centre, which started in 1975. And over the past 10 years, we've worked particularly closely with other groups based at the Women's Centre to defend mothers fighting against being separated from our children, whether by the state and or by violent fathers taking them away, by immigration or other racist laws which separate families, or by the separation imposed by overwork and poverty. And the groups that have been particularly working on this issue, who are part of the coalition, are Black Women's Rape Action Project, Women Against Rape, WinVisible, Women with Visible and Invisible Disabilities, and the All African Women's Group. So in January 2017, we published our dossier, Suffer the Little Children and Their Mothers, which documented 50 cases of mothers who had come to the groups at the Women's Centre over the previous few years, who needed support either with trying to prevent social services taking their children, trying to get the children back, stopping children being forcibly adopted, fighting court orders that made children live with or have contact with violent fathers despite being warned of the dangers. And we documented which families were being targeted and how. Now, this was not an academic exercise or research for the sake of our careers or anybody's career. Our aim was to describe, quantify and publicise the traumatic and discriminatory treatment of children, mothers and grandmothers, and sometimes fathers, by the state and by the institutions who are in charge of child protection. And we have used the dossier as evidence to campaign to overturn the policies and practices which are responsible for this tragedy. Since that time, we founded the Support Not Separation Coalition. We hold monthly pickets outside the Central Family Court in London and sometimes in Brighton. And we hold monthly self-help meetings for mums and grands and their supporters who want to take charge of their own cases. And we are continuing to publicise these issues wherever and whenever we can. So since we published the dossier, even more women contacted us who were desperate to change their situation and not be separated from their children. So that's been about 130 women who've called the Women's Centre for help, or they've been referred by others who know about our work, or we've met them outside the family court when we do our monthly pickets. And the findings I'm going to tell you about tonight are based on 80 mothers that we worked with, where we had enough, who had between them 159 children, where we felt that we had enough information about their cases to draw conclusions about what's been happening in this period. So, all the families are low income, 75% are single mother families. Wow. Some of them are parents who are working together to keep their children. Several are grandmothers or other close relatives. 64% of the mothers had all their children taken from them. 15% of the mothers had some of the children taken, and 21% were trying to stop the children being taken, and some had succeeded. 12% of the mums had some or all of the children adopted. 25% had some or all of the children in foster care, and about 10% had children being looked after by a family member or friend under a special guardianship order. Women of colour are disproportionately affected. 36% of the mums who came to us are women of colour, and immigrant families are also disproportionately affected. 21% of the mothers who came to us were immigrants, including asylum seekers. A high proportion, about 34%, have mental health issues, and another 19% have a disability. And that's without taking account of the stress and the mental health issues that are caused by going through the process. 44% of mothers have been victims of rape and/or domestic violence, and 26% had some or all of their children living with fathers who in almost every case had previously been violent, including coercive and controlling behaviour towards the mother and/or the children. 24% of the mothers were from outside London, where there are even fewer resources than there are in London. So, what's triggered social services involvement? This is just a snapshot, and I know that everybody will have an example which will, add to the triggers. But the triggers that I'll just mention a few. A mum asks for help to leave a violent father, or having left him was blamed for not wanting him to see the children. She gets accused of being overprotective or anxious or manipulative, and the social services support the children going to live with their father. Mum asks for help with perhaps a housing situation, but gets no help and is accused of not having suitable housing, so the children get taken instead of her housing being addressed. Mum has a drink and is accused of being drunk while in charge of a child and gets a caution for neglect. Mum needs help with the child's health issues, for example, because the child has autism or has a disability, and the mum's desperately trying to get some resources, including educational resources. They don't get the resources, and the children get taken instead. Okay, a mother who was badly, for example, who was badly injured during childbirth because her husband's family insisted that she gave birth at home. He was banned from seeing the child at the beginning, but by the end of the court process, that child, who was about 2, was sent to live with his father, who had been violent to the mother, and the mother had only supervised contact on an occasional basis. Okay, a young mum fails, in inverted commas, a parenting assessment in a mother and baby unit, and her baby is put up for adoption. And we know that mums are set up to fail in those institutions. We'll be hearing a bit more about that. And we know that any mum who has lost a child or children already faces the prospect of babies being taken at birth. And there's been a big increase in adoptions of babies of under a year old. And that's clearly a motivating factor in taking them. Okay, so just to give an idea, for example, of the women we meet outside the family court on any given day when we're there, we usually meet at least 4 or 5 mums or families coming out of court who have heartbreaking stories of separation. They nearly all have very bad lawyers, I have to say. They often are up against very biased social work reports or psychiatric reports which have really demonised them. So, for example, a family of 6 kids from African immigrant parents. The 6 kids were taken after one of the children, who was about 4 or 5, said that his brother hit him, and then changed his mind that it wasn't his brother, it was somebody else. But they swooped in, took all 6 children, and they end up in separate foster care, scattered around, and the 2 older teenage siblings, they've all been separated because there were 8 children altogether. Okay. There's a black mother with mental health problems whose 10-year-old daughter was taken into foster care, who was moved very far away, who was fighting to be able to see the child. And it's very common that the children are moved out of London, maybe go to Leicester, maybe go up north, and it's very hard, as you'll all know, to keep contact with them. There's a young mum who's been homeless since she left care at 16, and is put, as I say, into a mother and baby unit with a 5-day-old baby, and probably the outcome won't be good because those mother and baby units are awful. Sometimes mums who've given birth, even by cesarean, 2 days previously, are in the family court fighting to stop the child being taken. So, and the fact is that mothers come under the most intense scrutiny, unlike anything else, because every aspect of their life comes under scrutiny once social services are involved. How you keep your house, what clothes you wear, how you talk, how you express yourself, What are your theories of child rearing, and are they acceptable? Do you vaccinate your child? What medication do you give your child? Who are your friends? What are your relationships like? It's a very intense level of scrutiny. And then, if the children have been taken, you're expected to act normally in supervised contact, even though it's a completely artificial situation. You're criticised if you're too emotional, because that might upset the kids. You're criticised if you're not emotional enough, because maybe you don't really love them enough. And you really can't win in those situations. And yet that's the situation where assessments are being done to see if the children can come back to you, or if it's a baby, to see who's taken at birth, to see if the baby can come back. Okay, so we know, and nobody, in none of that is that if the child behaves a bit weirdly in a contact session, which they may well do, they haven't seen the mum for a month, maybe 2 months after being snatched away, even when they were breastfeeding, the child is cautious or scared or feels a bit weird to see mum, that is attributed to the bad mothering rather than to the trauma that that child has obviously gone through from being separated from their mum. And it's the whole issue of it, to say that the child isn't properly attached. But that is a very artificial situation, those contact sessions. And all too often, not always, but very often, social workers impose their own, usually very middle-class standards on working-class mums, and we're set up to fail, basically. Older children are not believed when they say they want to go home, and even when they keep running away from foster care and make their way home. But when they say they don't want to go home, none of the professionals consider that they might be too scared or worried about what the foster carer will think if they actually say what they want. So their voice is not listened to or paid any attention to. And also they don't take account of the fact that if the foster care is if they're fostering to adopt, that the foster carers have a vested interest in what they report about the child. And yes, the child was very upset after seeing mum. So instead of looking into what was the reason for that, the automatic assumption is nearly always, well, that must be mum's fault. So better the child doesn't see the mum at all than be upset about seeing her. Okay, and mothers who react to the stress of the situation and the trauma of being separated are accused of being over-emotional, anxious, depressed, etc. But if you weren't depressed or anxious when your child has been taken away, you wouldn't be normal. I mean, it's a completely obvious response that it's going to be very, very distressing and upsetting to the mum as well as the child. But that is never taken into account, and mothers are always the over-emotional ones. Disability is commonly used to label mums as being unfit. A mum who we met outside the family court with her partner when they were fighting to get a 12-year-old back from foster care, she'd been sent away. She was one of the ones who'd been sent away. And she and her partner, she suffers from epilepsy, been coming to our self-help meetings to press to try to see the child in foster care, and they had also taken a baby up for adoption, even though the older child was 10, and they looked after the older child until he was 10, and then came in and took 2 children. Very tragically, she passed away 2 weeks ago, almost certainly as a result of an epileptic fit, after having just had a meeting with her housing association with the support of one of our volunteers, because they were being harassed by their neighbours, which had also contributed, seriously harassed over a long time. They were a black working class couple in an increasingly gentrified area, and the harassment that they faced in their housing contributed to the children being taken away as well. So that we are definitely here to fight for justice for Lami and for all mothers who are in that horrendous situation. The welfare checklist makes no mention of the harm of separation. It just doesn't figure anywhere. And if the judge does mention it, they might say, well, if this child could speak, they probably would say they'd like to stay with their mum, but we've decided differently, so tough. We know that there's a lot more to be said about this. We're just scratching the surface about the harm that separation causes. But in saying do no harm, there is a proviso in the law that in any given case, they do not have to make an order. There is a make no order possibility. And that's what we're saying. They don't have to make an order for separation. And that's why we're fighting for support and not separation.
Thank you, Anne. Our next speaker is Andy Bilson, Emeritus Professor of Social Work at the University of Central Lancashire, who has provided us with very good and new research.
Okay, how do you follow that? That's such a telling picture of what's happening at the moment in child protection. And what I want to talk to you about today is that it doesn't have to be like that. But first of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this new piece of research which is out there. And I'm not going to apologise for telling you about numbers, because if you're campaigning to make a difference, you need to know what's happening in the system. So this research gives you a picture of what's happening in the system. So I'll briefly tell you about that, and then tell you about my practice when we actually reduced the numbers of children in care in a local authority in Scotland by 70%. First of all, on this picture, what you'll see is a graph with an arrow on it. What that shows you is what was happening to two groups of 5-year-olds. What I looked at, using a Freedom of Information request, was all children who were born in a particular year, what happened to them before they were 5. One group were 5 last year, in 2017, and the other group were 5 years earlier. So you can start to see what has changed in just that 5 years between those two sets of children being born. And the graph shows you that there's been a 16% increase in being referred, but in fact there's been a 52% increase in children being adopted, in the numbers of children adopted, and a 51% increase in children having been investigated for abuse. In actual fact, the numbers that were put on the child protection plan didn't go up as much. What that means is that there are more investigations that find nothing. There are more investigations that don't lead to a child protection plan. It's gone from, I think it was, let me look at the numbers and I'll tell you. It's gone from 50% of all investigations found leading to a child protection plan to only 36% over the last few years. So huge changes in what's happening. What that means is that last year, every 4 minutes and 40 seconds, an investigation started that didn't find anything. Every 4 minutes and 40 seconds, day and night, 120,000 investigations that found nothing last year. And it's going up. It's been going up every year since 2008. So that's the first part of this story. The second is, well, what does that mean about how many children are actually involved in the child protection system? And there's a picture with a funnel on it. And that's a picture of what percentage of all children who were 5 in 2017 had reached all these different stages of the child protection system. So 1 in 5 children, of all children, and this was a study that looked at more than half of all local authorities in the country. It's a big study. 1 in 5 children were referred. 1 in 7 children were found to be in need. That's legally saying that they need service in order to prevent them from harm and to promote their welfare. 1 in 16 of all children were investigated for child abuse. This is massive. It's absolutely massive. You know, this is not a small thing. This is more than children with serious disabilities. This is more than most most other things that you would want to count in this way. This is a massive thing. And this is just before they're 5. That proportion of children can only go up. It can only go up because more of those children born in that year will be investigated. More of those children born in that year will be on child protection plans before they reach the age of 18. So that's what that funnel tells you. And finally, what I also found was that there was what I've called a postcode lottery. What happens to you depends on what local authority you live in. Some local authorities are far more active, take far more children into care, adopt more children than others. In fact, there's a 12-fold difference in the numbers of children who are adopted before they're 5 between those local authorities that take the fewest children for adoption and those who take the most. And that isn't accounted for by any differences in things like poverty or deprivation. Those differences are purely about activity, about what people are doing. And it leads to nearly 2% of all children in Southampton having been adopted or being placed on an order waiting for adoption by the age of 5. Nearly 2% of all children in Southampton. So you need to know these figures. You need to know them. On my website, which is down the bottom, you've got all these studies. You've got other studies I've done that have looked at adoption and show that, for example, there are big differences in the rates of adoption in different local authorities. That the number of children on any one day who are adopted is now far more than the number of children who are in care, and will continue to rise for at least another 10 years, even if the adoption rates stay at the 2017 levels. So that's the facts and figures. What it shows is a huge change in what is happening in social work. I think we've totally lost any idea that social work is about support. It's purely become something that's about investigation and blame. Yeah. And what drives that is a culture of rescue. When you try to rescue somebody from something, there's a something that you rescue them from, something that's evil. And I think its parents are increasingly being seen as that evil thing that we're trying to rescue them from. So, does it have to be like that? Do we have to work in that way? When I started working in Fife, and this is a long time ago because I spent a lot of time working internationally, advising governments on what to do about social work and so on. And I came home to work here because I saw that really bad practices from America and England were starting to be promulgated in Africa and in Russia and the other places I worked. It doesn't have to be like that. When we worked in Fife, I was responsible for all the research and development, and I was eventually a senior manager, as assistant director of social work for the department. In just 3 years, we reduced the numbers of children in care by 70%. Just 3 years. And a lot of that wasn't about massive increases in resources. What we did do was that we made some cash available to frontline workers who were working with families that they could spend on helping families. This was legal because in Scotland there's a legal act that allows you to give money to spend to prevent children going into care. We gave them the equivalent, each of our 7 area offices, we gave them the equivalent of the cost of 1 child in care for a year. The numbers of children in care went down by, I think, over 200. So we gave out the cost of 7 children in care for a year, and we got a reduction of 200 children. It's huge. We were awash with money. We spent a lot of it back into the system. We spent a lot of it on children and families. We spent a lot of it on older people because we wanted to help everybody. And when you stop spending and wasting money on very expensive solutions, you can spend things on other types of solutions. So that's one example. lot about the need to deal with the financial crash. I went and spent some time doing some work in Malta. Malta have taken a different approach to how they responded to the crash. They decided to put more money into supporting the poorest in society. They put in work with people in local communities. They put in helpers so that when somebody was applying for a job, if they couldn't get a job, they could have a mentor to get them into work. They could have somebody to actually work with them to help them get into work. They put in some money into the whole business of support, family support. So they did things like they made free childcare for children under 5. What happened? Well, Malta's economy is thriving. It was the fastest growing economy in the year I was there, which was last year. I'm going out there again in a few weeks, so I'll report back. The numbers of children being taken into care is falling. The numbers of people in poverty is falling. We can do these things. We just have to do something different. We have to stop going with this mad idea that we're all in it together. We're not. The poorest in society are not in it together. All this research is on my website. Thank you, Anne, for inviting me here today. And if you've got any questions or thoughts, I'll be outside afterwards as well.
Thank you. Okay, my next speaker is Olive Howell. Go ahead.
Good evening. My name's Olive, and I'm a mother to my 13-year-old daughter. She was taken from me aged 9. We had unwarranted intervention from the social services since my daughter was age 8. This was shortly after my mother had died, and we had to go to Jamaica. I homeschooled her for a short period of time, and despite having the authorisation, the social services started a campaign of harassment against me and my daughter. They was bullying us, slandering me, embarrassment, threats, and finally they imprisoned me, and that's how I got my daughter after a year. Whilst I was in prison, they made me sign a Section 20 that my daughter would be looked after for a few days, and it took me 4 years to get my daughter back. During the court hearing, they stated that they wanted us to be united, but that didn't happen. I believe that this was institutional racism, as we was never given a reason why she was taken and kept from me, and even now she's been returned to me, they still can't give me a reason. They separated my child from me, they isolated her from her family, her friends, the area that we live in, and they even stopped her from going to the secondary school of her choice with all of her friends. My daughter, who was once confident, bright and healthy, she became very tearful, withdrawn and clingy. Before she was taken from me, social services used to come to our home almost every day to check. They wanted to just walk in as if it was their home. They treated it as if it was their home. It was very intimidating. Sometimes when I refused them entry or I wasn't home, they'd call the police and they'd break into my home. And as a result of all the pressure, my daughter started to suffer terrible headaches and she was losing sleep. The social worker even stated in one of her reports that my daughter was being affected by theirs and the police's intervention, but they continued. The significant harm that they claim that she was at risk of is exactly what they've caused her by removing her from me. They isolated her so that she was in the hands of strangers with absolutely no protection. That was a significant harm, and we have to live with the consequences today. We had to endure meeting up in this horrible contact centre under supervision. My daughter would be sobbing her heart out at every session, just hoping that she could come home with me. She would cry on the phone so much that it caused her to catch her breath. But I was helpless. I couldn't comfort her and I couldn't protect her, because I didn't even know where she was. No value was put on our relationship, her relationship with me as her mother, and how important it was for her well-being and her happiness. The contact centre stopped, and I didn't see my daughter again for 1.5 years. They tried to eliminate me completely out of their life. The social worker constantly told her I'm not going to get her back until she's 18. I'm keeping her. I don't want her to have any contact with you. I don't want her to know you. I want her to know your address or where you live. I was told that she was always crying in school and asking her friends' mothers to please speak to the social worker, as I want to go home and I want to see my mum. Some of the mothers wrote to me to tell me what was going on, and they even went and approached the social workers. One mother even offered to foster my baby so that she could stay local, but all to no avail. We used to communicate secretly via our iPad, but when they realised, they punished her and confiscated our iPad. I didn't get to speak to her for 4 months again, and the social worker even made her give him the passcode and the passwords to our iPad, and it wasn't returned to her for 2 years. She was told not to speak to me or she would be moved to another placement, and she was to call the police if she saw me. I kept hearing the words all throughout this day, it's always in her best interest. But what I saw was that a once happy and confident child had become terrified. With help from Legal Action for Women, I managed to get the case back to court. We got the social worker off the case, and nearly a year later, in July, she finally came home and the child I knew, she's now traumatised, she's anxious, she's confused. Our lives and our relationship is almost destroyed. She's fearful, she's insecure, she's manipulated. She was also physically uncared for. Her hair was, and her general appearance, which we used to take such pride in. She has dreadlocks, they hadn't been combed or washed for about 9 months. She was wearing torn tights to school, and she looked in a complete state. The social worker later told me after she had been returned home that the foster lady was cold and unloving, and that she shouldn't be looking after children anymore, and that my daughter had been neglected by them. The court agreed that we should get support with the transition, but so far we've got nothing. We've been left without any help or support from the social services to deal with the significant harm that they caused, which could take a very, very long time, if at all ever. But at least now we are together, and I can help her and support her so she can deal in her own way with what has been done to her.
Olive, thank you for that painful, very painful recollection, and for sharing the fact that we won. That we won after 4 years. It took 4 years, but your daughter is back. She belongs. And I have to say, I was at some of the contact meetings with the social workers, and it was absolutely shocking to see that when you asked what was the reason why this child was taken, nobody could give a reason. And this is not going to be the end of the story. So thank you all. Okay, the next speaker is, well, on my list. Okay, Dr. Radha Kothari, clinical psychologist.
To be honest, I'm finding it quite hard to follow that because I was so touched by it, and feel like I should apologise on behalf of my profession, to be perfectly honest. I'm a clinical and research psychologist who works with the Support Not Separate Coalition as a consultant and a researcher. During this time, I've read a number of reports that have been written by other psychologists and by psychiatrists. These reports are about mothers who are undergoing a period of assessment. The assessment is normally undertaken by a range of professionals, which will determine whether they are fit to parent their own child. As you can imagine, this is probably no easy task, and it shouldn't be. Though I am not a mother myself, I am a daughter, and I cannot imagine what my life would have been like had I been separated from my parents, and likely as a result, my 3 siblings. Neither of my parents were born in England. As a result of this, I imagine that if a group of professionals from England had taken a snapshot into my early childhood, they would have found it to be quite different from their own. My parents are not only under tremendous pressure, financial pressure, due to our financial circumstances, but in addition they were undertaking the incredibly difficult task of holding on to their own culture while also learning what was expected of them by the very different westernised society they were now living in. On one occasion, when I was very young, my mother was forced to leave me at home for a short time, responsible for the care of my 2 younger sisters. This was not something that happened regularly, and it was something that happened out of necessity, not out of neglect or bad parenting, just necessity. As an elder sibling, playing a role in the care of their younger siblings is not uncommon in either of the countries in which my parents were raised. And the circumstances arose because my parents could not afford childcare. At this time, which was over 30 years ago now, services became involved. It did not lead to separation, but it also did not lead to support. Perhaps because of my background, as a psychologist, I'm particularly sensitive to the variety of different factors that might influence any individual that I'm working with. What has struck me most about the reports that I have read as part of my work with the Coalition is a lack of consideration that is given to the individual circumstances of each mother that is assessed. My background makes me acutely sensitive to the lack of understanding of a mother's ethnic and cultural background. Comments are often made in reports about how a mother does not act during the assessment in a formal enough manner. For example, due to how they sit, or how they address a professional by his or her first name. This is generally interpreted as the mother not taking on board the seriousness of their situation, or as if they do not care enough. When reading these descriptions of how a mother comes across, however, I am aware that this is likely due to their lack of experience or understanding of the westernised approach to psychology or assessment. At a most basic level, anyone who is being assessed should understand what the assessment is for and the language that is being used. Often the interpreter being provided is not able to understand or explain this, and is not even using the mother's first language. The reports that I have read, and the mothers that I have spoken with, show a wide range of examples of this lack of consideration. By this, I mean that in most cases, a mother's ethnicity or cultural background, her socio-demographic circumstances, any history of mental or physical health difficulties, any trauma or any disabilities are rarely given proper consideration. Professionals appear to have a one-size-fits-all approach to assessment, and history has shown time and time again that this is not an approach that results in inequality. Imagine, for those of you that have not been through this, being a parent that is threatened with forced separation from your child, and imagine the fear that you would be experiencing. In this situation, sorry, I missed a page, I apologise. Sorry. The parents that I've spoken with in my work with the Coalition and in my clinical work have made it clear to me that when services become involved, they feel under attack, not in a position of being offered support. It is normal for anyone that feels under attack to experience fear. Fear is a strong emotion. It results in any human being having a physical and psychological response that is often described as fight or flight. To put it simply, when we feel under threat, we are evolutionarily programmed to fight back or to run away. Now, I'd like you to imagine, if you haven't been through it, being a parent that is threatened with forced separation from your child, and imagine the fear that you would be experiencing. In this situation, neither fight nor flight is an option. Imagine now the constant anxiety that you would feel as a result of being repeatedly assessed by a range of different professionals that you've never met, and whose roles you did not fully understand. Imagine feeling like you are being constantly watched by social workers, mental health professionals, and teachers. Would this encourage you to work with professionals? Would it encourage you to be honest about the difficulties that you're experiencing? Would it put you in a position where you felt comfortable asking for help? The reality is that mothers feel trapped. If they ask for help, they reveal weaknesses that might lead to their child being taken away. And if they tell professionals that everything is fine, they are judged as lying, or having no understanding of the effect that their difficulties are having on their children. Psychological instability and mental health difficulties are often cited within these reports for why a mother should be forcibly separated from her child. It is obviously important not to minimise the effect of parental mental health on a child's development and well-being. However, we currently live in a society where over a quarter of the population will at some point in their life be diagnosable with a mental health disorder. We also know that the life events that we experience, the difficult circumstances we're in, impact upon our mental health. The parents that I've had contact with are often experiencing incredibly difficult circumstances, whether this is due to poverty, abuse, immigration difficulties, past trauma, or lack of support. Add to this the intense scrutiny that they are under from services, and it's difficult to imagine many people withstanding the pressure while showing themselves to be what professionals deem to be a good parent. It is also worth noting here that the standards that must be reached for being a good parent can vary a great deal from one professional to another. Initial findings and anecdotal evidence show the devastating and destructive effects of forcibly separating a child from their parents. Adoptions break down. Mothers are repeatedly separated from other children that they give birth to. Mothers spend their lives worrying about their children, and children grow up wondering about their true heritage, which has undeniable effects on their identity. In addition, the ongoing support provided to children who are separated is highly variable, while support for mothers is practically non-existent. But there will always be some situations, however far and few between, where it is in the best interest for a child to be rehomed. So how do we act in the best interest of everyone involved? In my research with Support Not Separate, we are taking the approach that the people most informed about how families can be best supported is the families themselves. While I do not undervalue the expertise and knowledge of all professionals working with families and conducting much needed research, the families and the mothers are the experts in their own individual experiences. In line with this, we propose to conduct research with mothers, not on mothers. We aim to explore the circumstances which lead to services becoming involved, the experience of being assessed, and the kind of support that they would find helpful both during and after assessment, whatever the outcome. In addition to giving mothers a voice in the kind of research that is being done, we also hope to increase their knowledge of the current systems. We believe that mothers who have experience of assessment and separation should be empowered to engage with the system by which they are being measured. And confident in providing insight on how these systems can be made more inclusive and less damaging. Even though it was over 30 years ago, I remember the fear that my mother experienced when services became involved in our lives. My mother was not a bad mother. She was a mother dealing with difficult circumstances. She was an incredible mother who fought against these difficult circumstances and protected us from them the best way she knew how. If services had separated us from our parents, if they had separated us as siblings, the psychological effects on my mental health would, no doubt, have been enormous. And I wonder whether I would be here speaking with you now on this important topic with 2 doctorates and an incredibly fulfilling life. Without my parents, none of what I have achieved would have been possible. I strongly believe that we should see the mothers that come into contact with services as who they are. Not bad mothers, but actually as mothers who are suffering and enduring against the complex and difficult problems within our society. Mothers who are going through a tough time, not mothers who cannot be trusted to bring up their children. By providing support, not just assessment, by conducting research with mothers, we stand the best chance of avoiding the tragedy of unnecessary separation and getting the best long-term outcomes for everyone involved. Thank you.
That's the kind of professionals we like. You want more of those? Okay, now our next speaker is Shola Raquel. Raquel, did I pronounce that okay,
Thank you.
You're breastfeeding peer supporter. Go ahead.
Hello, good evening everyone. My name is Shola
encouragement and help to nurture the new life. We offer to support on how to physically hold and position the baby for breastfeeding to get optimum feed, and how mum can judge that her baby is gaining weight and thriving, and how frequently the baby will feed and sleep in those first crucial days. We also reassure mum of babies' changing habits and how to read baby feeding cues. We treat each mother with the utmost respect and take into account many of the fears and questions they may have about their birth experience, their own and their family's expectations, and those which also turn into a lot of pressure on a new mum. Mum manages all this while adjusting to the flood of emotions and pregnancy hormones that her body would be subject to, having just given birth and adjusting to the new physical changes in her body and the responsibility of a whole new life totally dependent on her. A new mother is the centre of a family's love and affection, as is the new baby. A mother's own instinct guides her to protect and love her baby at all costs. That means much support is needed for mothers so that they can spend as much time together to develop an inseparable bond that lasts for a child's lifetime. When she feels tired or just needs a break and needs to hand that baby to a family member who will be vigilant watching over whilst asleep. We would also let mum know where she can meet other mums in drop-ins to share their thoughts and feelings and have the company of other mothers coping with their young infants, perhaps while family members are at work. We are there to congratulate and support mothers. A mother has to adjust to the lack of sleep, which is a total change of lifestyle and continues for the months and years ahead. Suggesting how other family members can help out also allows for a new mum's recuperation time. My experience supporting a mother who was under threat of having her baby taken away at birth, after an older child had been taken away 18 months previously for a reason I don't agree with, was very disturbing and the very opposite of what should have been done. Happily, we succeeded in keeping the baby. This mother's natural joy of expecting and giving birth to that precious child was constantly undermined by the fear and terror of losing that baby. She was not treated with respect from the authorities, isolated and treated as if she had committed some kind of crime. She was deemed unworthy to give birth and to look after her own child due to a past judgment of her behaviour. Anyone would feel depressed and angry at the injustices of such unfair power by professional women over another woman's body. As an asylum seeker, she had only very basic English-speaking skills and was subject to decisions being made about her and her child, which were often not even explained in her own language. She spent 6 months in a residential assessment centre where she was under constant surveillance. At the beginning, she was only allowed very limited visits from her sister and only allowed out with the baby under supervision of a member of staff. She was monitored 24/7 to see if she made any inverted comma mistakes, which she was terrified of doing as it could have led to her baby being taken away from her. And in her words, she says about this whole experience, "When they took my first child from me, my arms, it felt like my heart was ripped apart. I will never forget the cries and the look in her eyes. They never gave me notice. They just came and told me they were taking the baby and sending me to a mental hospital. I couldn't understand why it was happening. They took her whilst I was breastfeeding. I think the harm done to her by being taken from me was horrendous, and they didn't say anything about that. They wanted to have her adopted, but we managed to stop that, and she is now living with her aunt. If she'd been adopted, I would never have seen her again, she would never have seen me or any of my family. I'm happy that she's with my sister, and I know she's happy. When I gave birth to my second child, I was terrified of being taken away. I didn't want him to go through what my first child went through. I was happy to go to a residential assessment centre because at least he would be with me, and I was constantly worried about it. I was watched 24 hours a day on CCTV, and every time the baby cried, I was worried they would accuse me of something. Every time I changed a snappy or was breastfeeding, if the baby cried or if you brought up milk, I was worried that I would be accused of harming him. Even putting him to sleep and covering him with a blanket, I worried if I had done it well enough. They would come into the room at night and accuse me of tampering with the CCTV camera, although I was asleep. I had no privacy, including while breastfeeding. There was no lock on the door. Every time I had an assessment appointment, I was terrified of being accused of lying. Even if I had lunch at my sister's, I had to cook when I got back to the residential centre, otherwise they would ask questions and say that I'd lost weight. I was also asked why I was changing baby's clothes had the baby been sick. With my first child, I had no one to talk to and tell how I was feeling, and no one gave me advice. It was completely different with my second child. I had support from the Crossroads Women's Centre. They were like a family helping me. The centre changed my life. I was always sad and I couldn't smile before, as no other place I'd been to was ready to help me, and I'd always been turned away. As a breastfeeding supporter, I want to say how shocking it is that a mother and her newborn child should be submitted to such treatment. How could anyone thrive under these circumstances? On top of the constant mental pain of this situation, this mother was denied the support and the help of her family at this very crucial time. She had to endure the threat of the police snatching her child on the labour ward when they were parked outside, waiting for court order, and 24 hours CCTV scrutiny, fearing being told that she was an unfit mother and could not keep her own child. This is physical and mental torture, endured at a time when the relationship between a mother and a baby needs to be nurtured. Despite the torture of living like this for 6 months, her baby has flourished. He's one of the most content, thriving little boys I know, and they are both now living with their family. Every time I see him, I think that the life of this very happy child could have been so ruined had we not all rallied to support it.
Thank you very much, Jordan. It's good to win, it's really good to win. Okay, next, who do we have? Okay, Victoria Childs, Psychotherapy and Counsellors Union. This is another kind of professional that we like.
Thanks. Well, I'm sorry, but I'm not able to speak to you tonight about the lifelong impact of separating children from their birth families. And this is because it's not a lifelong impact. The impact of removing children from their birth families is transgenerational. It creates an emotional imprint of trauma which operates on a historic level, and it damages the whole fabric of society far into the future and sometimes over hundreds of years. We create a level of trauma through forced separation which is so painful that it can't be contained in one lifetime. It can leave such children and often their descendants open to leading diminished lives, suffering mental distress, often with greater chances of entering the criminal justice system, of experiencing addictions or committing suicide. The human and spiritual cost of all that is one thing, but the economic aspect also affects us all. It's just a huge waste of human potential in every sense. portrayal of the native Aboriginal peoples and the native peoples of America and Canada, and how they've been derided as lazy and alcoholic. But we know that these communities have had their children systematically removed over hundreds of years by colonials. How easy to blame the victims. We might also be familiar with the negative portrayal of Afro-Caribbean men as bad parents and abandoning fathers. We know that generations ago, black fathers were systematically removed from their families by slave traders who exploited them for profit, and the families were split up. Such traumas damage people over generations. The history of forced separations is a shameful one. And today we need to be very careful about the kind of legacies we are creating. We need to be mindful that the very bonds of civilization are forged in the womb and shortly afterwards in the symbiotic relationship between the baby and the mother. How we all learn to care for each other as humans is based on the quality and texture of that primary relationship. It's the basis of all subsequent social relationships. It's the basis of society and of a sense of social justice. The most sacred image in the world, in the whole of human culture, is of the mother and baby, and it can be seen replicated all over the world. The idea that we can tinker with this relationship is a perilous one. The basic tenets of psychoanalytic theory are also founded on the primacy of the mother and baby relationship, and the more recent developments in neuroscience have borne this out. For instance, the growth of neural pathways in the brain have been found to be determined by the security and containment of the relationship between the baby and the mother. And the baby's brain development can be inhibited by the disturbance of the relationship. There's a recent study coming out of Canada, the ACE study, that's ACE, on adverse childhood experiences, and that includes separation from parents. So it studies brain development after trauma, and it links traumatic separation to all the problems I've mentioned previously, as well as morbidity, so premature morbidity through strokes and illness, etc. So basically it can kill you. So why is it then that we see the family courts and their associated professionals like CAFCAS, social workers and even the court-appointed psychiatrists completely ignore all of this evidence and treat children and mothers as though they exist in a vacuum, disconnected from each other, their wider families and the whole of society? Perhaps it fits in with their state parent ethos, which is in itself a political directive, but we say it's wrong. And the levels of misinformation that we're hearing coming out of the family courts is quite frankly astonishing. So the members of our union voted overwhelmingly to affiliate with the Support Not Separation Coalition, because as psychotherapists we hear these repeating cycles of suffering every day in our consulting rooms. We listen to the impact of forced separations. That's our job. And I personally work with people in their 60s and 70s who are still traumatised by being separated from their families as children under the age of 5. As psychotherapists, we can speak with authority about the damage separation does, and we want our opinions heard. And this is entirely preventable damage. Spending money on keeping families together, however they're struggling, makes economic sense, whereas prioritising adoption as the gold standard and incentivising social workers to remove babies is a scandalous misuse of resources. It damages the whole of society and is entirely counterproductive. And we as a union stand in solidarity with this campaign to redirect these funds into supporting families to stay together, however they might be struggling. It's straightforward, it's cost effective, we've got the skills to do it, and carrying on as we are is damaging the future for all of us.
Thank you very much, Victoria. I now turn to this
Domestic violence is now one of the key reasons for state intervention and often separation of the child from the mother. We face two key problems in family proceedings. One, women are routinely disbelieved, and if they are believed, professionals sometimes blame the mother for causing what they call significant harm to the child who has witnessed violence. Secondly, children are disbelieved, or their fears and concerns about their father ignored. They also remove children from mothers if they decide there's a risk of future significant emotional harm. You might have heard that phrase. It's nebulous and it's sometimes spurious. Defining witnessing violence as significant harm is written into the law and has to be changed. Often they also find other reasons to remove the child, such as poverty or mental health, as some of them have been spoken about. And it's shocking how many of these children are placed with a violent father. But little or no account is taken of the harm to both mother and child of the removal. Removing children who witnessed domestic violence was successfully challenged in a remarkable New York legal action in 2004 in a case called Nicholson versus Williams. Leading experts on domestic violence testified on the harm to children of witnessing domestic violence and the harm of removing children from the non-violent parent. They testified that many factors influenced whether there was harm and the degree of harm. Things like the level of violence, the age, and other stresses. But most children were resilient once they escaped the violent situation into a safe and stable environment with a loved one. And even when witnessing violence did harm them, removing the child from the non-violent parent was found to be more harmful and more traumatic. One expert testified that removal under such circumstances, quote, is tantamount to pouring salt in an open wound. Removals can make a child terrified for the mum's safety. They may also blame themselves for the separation. The judge ruled that children should no longer be removed for witnessing domestic violence, and it changed the legal landscape. Other potential harms of removing a child from mother, of course, include placing the child with a violent father, placing the child in a care home where children can suffer appalling violence, as we've heard from the survivors of Rotherham and Shirley Oaks homes, or a foster system. And I've met plenty of survivors too who've been abused by foster fathers. A study in the US found that 80% of foster care failed, and the children's post-traumatic stress disorder was double the rate among Iraq war veterans. Women Against Rape has campaigned for over 10 years to establish that it's very rare for women to lie about rape and domestic violence. It's a minuscule amount compared to the actual violence suffered, 90% of which is never prosecuted. But in family courts, the clock is turned back 30 years at least. They've even fallen behind standards in criminal trials. The secrecy of family courts has protected them from public scrutiny. Sexism, racism and class bias is rife among judges, social workers and CAFCAS, and many of them are women. 2017 regulations to treat victims as vulnerable witnesses in those courts are often ignored. Queen Mary University and Women's Aid Research just found that 24% of victims of domestic violence in family courts were cross-examined directly by their own attacker. A single judge rules on whether the violence you describe is fact or fiction. Children's reports of abuse are often dismissed as lies or a result of what they call parental alienation by the mother. Recent CAFCAS guidance announced that children may be taken from mothers who alienate the father. This is the influence of the Fathers Lobby. Families Need Fathers, for example, is a charity which publicly dismisses most women's allegations of domestic violence as false, calling them a motorway to obtaining legal aid. But last year, CAFCAS and NSPCC both spoke at Families Need Fathers Conference, which Support Not Separation picketed. Parental alienation was the theory of an American psychiatrist called Richard Alan Gardner. 20 years ago, Gardner testified in the family trial of 3 teenage boys, saying that they had been brainwashed by their mother to say that their father was violent to them. The judge believed the psychiatrist and not the boys, and ordered visits to continue, threatening to jail the mother if she didn't force them to go. One of the boys committed suicide, but Gardner was unrepentant. He carried on with his theories and his practices and books writing, but despite being widely discredited, case law rolled out his sexist views in family law right across America, and it became a standard, and now it's happening here. Grassroots mothers' movements are growing. Our Support Not Separation network and Mothers Unite UK, for example, have over 500 members, have each documented experiences of mothers, showing the patterns of fathers using family courts to continue abuse and control over mother and child after they've left him. Charities have documented children's murders following forced contact, and some have won some legal aid back for some mothers. In Parliament, a coalition of women MPs debated family law this July. Some said they had heard from hundreds of their women constituents who condemned outright CAFCAS and social workers' bias. But the MPs didn't condemn. They blamed the system, they said some changes need to be made. They called for training for social workers and CAFCAS officers and a review of the new regulations for vulnerable witnesses. It's frustrating that neither women MPs on the whole nor charities ever seem to make a really comprehensive case for mothers and our children to stay together. And also, violence is often siphoned off as if it's completely separate from all the other issues that mothers face, like class and race. The government has promised changes in family courts in their domestic violence bill, which is expected this autumn. And we want to campaign with whoever wants to campaign with us to ensure that some decent changes are made in that bill. Please join us on that. We have to make demands of charities and MPs. It's urgent to end the harm to children of wrongful separations and to women who are still being murdered at a rate of 2 every week by partners or ex-partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Donna Mason.
Hi. In the name of child protection, my only granddaughter suffered great harm and was deeply traumatised. She was forcibly adopted using the spurious and impossible premise that she was at possible risk of future emotional harm. People believe that because cases go through the court that there are safeguards. In fact, this is not how it works. If you are poor, working class, in need of support, services, housing, or have been in care, it can be used as proof that you are not fit to be a mother. My granddaughter's young, poor, vulnerable parents were never given a chance. There was no support for a young mum who had herself left home as a young teenager and so was vulnerable. No help, only a drive to remove our little girl from us. No crime had been committed, no abuse, no neglect. She was happy and thriving, even though her mum had been isolated and set up to fail in a mother and baby unit. We were not a threat. Using our past and our poverty, the social services set out to prove that she needed protecting from her loving parents and grandparents. And even when her foster carer wanted to adopt her, which would at least have meant she only suffered the trauma of separation once, it wasn't possible because of finances. And also because the social worker lied to the judge and said he couldn't contact the foster mum, when I know that he didn't even try. Throughout this brutal process, we were told it was being done in the best interests of my granddaughter. Our objections and disagreement were used to further prove we were unable to put her needs first. We were blamed and shamed, investigated and judged. We had to cooperate. They had all the power. We had only our anger and pain and our fear for her. To take an infant and display her on a video like a commodity, for her to meet only once with the couple who were to raise her, to be ripped from all she knew, for all relations with those who loved her severed, was not in her best interests. It was cruel. Everything she knew, her security, gone. New parents, new home, new sights, smells and sounds. She had no choice, no voice, no comprehension. I was terrified for her. If it happened to us as adults, to be taken from all we know, from our family and friends, to be transplanted to an alien environment without a voice or a choice, we would be lost and afraid. We would be traumatised. The authorities would not acknowledge that my granddaughter would be traumatised. In desperation, I rang the NSPCC because I wanted to protect her from that harm and suffering. The NSPCC said they could not help. They did not want to talk to me. Eyes were closed, ears were deaf, heads buried deep in the sand of denial. But what my granddaughter suffered and the lifelong consequences cannot be erased, even though they were buried and ignored. I worry about the questions my granddaughter will have. Will she wonder why she was adopted? Will she think she wasn't wanted, or that something awful happened which meant she was taken away? What is she being told about her family? Are we being demonised in her eyes so that she will be angry with us, or maybe too frightened to find us when she gets older? I have 3 grandsons. They are thriving. Because of what happened to my granddaughter, I am acutely aware of how easy it is for the state to take children from their loving mothers and families. And once you have had a child removed, it is proof in their eyes that you cannot be trusted to be a parent. They will come after you again. The threat and stigma follow you. The whole process is inhumane and antiquated. It blames and punishes individuals for the fault that lies in the uncaring, unequal and unfair society we live in. For the sake of the children, the system must change, and that is what we aim to do.
Fantastic panel and these fantastic speeches, really, and deeply truthful and moving. Before I asked P.M. Manuel-Buck, who very kindly, who is the Shadow Minister for Children and Families and with whom we have been working for a while, and who very kindly booked this room for us, with John MacDonald MP, the Shadow Chancellor, who is stuck on a train from Manchester, I understand, for the TUC conference, so we'll probably not make it, but we're very glad Emma is with us. Before we ask Emma to comment and say whatever she would like to tell us, I'd like to give people a sense of the range of places that people have come from to attend this meeting tonight. There are people here from Wales, from Yorkshire, from Huddersfield, from Devon, from Cheshire, from Ipswich, from Cambridgeshire, from Liverpool, from Wakefield, the Isle of Wight, Watford, Southampton, Northumberland, Kettering, Kent, Hertfordshire, Sussex, Surrey, Dorset, Norfolk, Suffolk, Manchester. And Somerset. And I think it really shows how much interest there is, but also how much pain and how much struggle and how much determination. And I have to say that it's mostly women in this room. And we welcome the men who have come to support the women. But it is mostly women who are going through this, and it is mostly women who are fighting for our children. And we are determined to win. It's going to take a while because the system is very entrenched, but we are determined to win. Now, Emma, please tell us what you think about what you've heard and about what you know. Emma is a former social worker.
Everyone hear me okay? Is this turned on? Yeah? All right. Okay, thanks everyone for having me here tonight. It's nice to not be the only person in the room who hasn't travelled far to get here. Apologies from my colleague Melanie On, who was sitting in the corner there earlier. She's had to leave. And of course, apologies from John McDonnell, who sponsored tonight's event with me. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about the political situation, which should come as no surprise, I'm a politician. So, we now have the largest number of children in care since the 1980s, and at my last check, care proceedings are up by a staggering 130%. What these figures suggest is that we are missing opportunities to safely avert the need for children to come into care, and that thousands of children, very likely at the end of these proceedings, will be placed into long-term foster care or adopted, signalling permanent severance between them and their birth family. Now, I know from when I practiced in social work, the pain caused to children, their wider birth family, and even sometimes their new family when they were removed from their parents' care. Even when it was deemed the safest thing to do, it is utterly, utterly heartbreaking. When opportunities to keep that family together have been missed, the heartache and the enduring pain never ever leaves all of those involved, and that includes those children. I cannot imagine the sheer anguish of having your child adopted against your will. It's one of the most severe acts that any state can take, and it should always be the absolute last resort. Many of you here may already know that my view is, and always has been, even when I was a practicing social worker, that absolutely everything should be done to support children to remain with their families, and for them to return to their family's care. The focus should always be on working with families in their local communities to prevent risks of children entering the care system in the first place. And if those children do need to be removed from their parents' care, then it should be to wider family or wider community members. Adoption should not be always the default option. What I think we need, and what I keep telling the Minister we need to enable services to move away from the expensive crisis-led model of prevention, where there are enough resources for families and children to be supported. The barrier for me to that happening is this current government. Everything they are doing is counter to the vision of keeping families together. They have cut the early intervention grant from local authorities. That was money that directly stopped children entering care by up to £600 million, with another million to come. They've left a gaping £2 billion gap in local authority budgets for children's social care by 2020. They've closed Sure Start and removed family support workers. They are closing the problem-solving model of the family drug and alcohol courts, which help keep children out of the care system and save the taxpayer 27 grand per family. As well as completely ignoring the groundswell of evidence and research and voices making it abundantly clear to the government that poverty and rising levels of care are interlinked, they just do not accept it. And to echo Andy's comments, you cannot separate cuts and austerity from children's social care. It's inextricably linked to wider societal and economic issues. One of my other issues with the government is that they remain ideologically welded to adoption above all other forms of care. They've made more than 20 changes to adoption policies since 2010. Back in 2012, the former Education Secretary said, "I firmly believe more children should be taken into care more quickly." He was then backed up by his colleague in the Lords, Lord Nash, who said proudly, "This government are strongly pro-adoption." There is something fundamentally wrong when we are seeing more children adopted in the UK than in any other European country, especially when 90% of those adoptions are without parental consent. Now, one of the major arguments that gets put forward for speeding up adoptions is that it would reduce the numbers of children in care. But the opposite has been the case. Research shows that adoption policies, rather than reducing the number of children in care, have actually led to a 65% increase in the number of children being separated from their parents. There are also worrying trends emerging where children are increasingly being removed from their mothers who are victims of domestic violence, where women aren't supported and instead are accused of failing to protect their children and often end up losing them as a result. This was something explained far better than I ever could by Lisa. In 2016, the Council of Europe criticised England for this very practice of removing children who've been in families where there's domestic abuse, and particularly so in the context of promoting forced adoptions. Now, I want to share with you something that some of you mightn't know. Last year, the government changed the legislation to make it so that prospective adopters can be prioritised over relatives or other carers in the Children and Social Work Act. This legislation can lead to children being prematurely placed with prospective adopters even before the conclusion of court proceedings. This is apparently in order to build a relationship with prospective adopters, but it can be used to undermine the child's prospect of ever going back to their birth family, extended family members or friends who love them dearly and have been trying their best to keep them in their care. It diminishes a child's right to a family life and risks early separation of siblings. It inflicts trauma and grief on children and their primary carers. The government needs to take a serious look at the patterns and trends in child protection, adoption and fostering, but instead they are continuing on this damaging path of pro-adoption. I want to remind you all here today that Labour do not believe that punitive welfare policies imposed by the state that result in the inevitability of poverty for so many is neglectful parenting. I want you to know that Labour do not believe those who have endured domestic violence should be doubly punished by having their children removed from their care. We as a party and I, as Chapel Children's Minister, will always fight to protect families and give children and their mothers the absolute best start in life, regardless of background, postcode or circumstances, because for my party and for me, the cost of doing nothing, of not doing so, is something that we are already seeing being borne out with tragic results for families right across Tory Britain.
Okay, thank you very much to Emma, who has to rush and vote. That's what she's been going in and out. So she probably will make it back just before we end. Okay, I would like now to open the floor for, there isn't much time, I'm sorry about that, but for very, please, brief questions and very brief comments. Okay, the sister here, I think the mics pick you up, so
okay,
don't worry about it. Please say who you are.
My name is Lee Jackman. I'm representing a group called Fight Back. We support over 600 women who are being falsely accused of FII, Munchausen by proxy. An FII masterclass is being taught up and down the country that claims autism, ME, Ehlers-Danlos, POTS, allergies and gastro issues are red flags for FII. This is leading for hundreds of innocent families, women, to be falsely accused. The one thing we deal with that takes 90% of our time is the lies of social workers. We would like social workers to wear cameras. We believe this would change the face of social work as it has done policing. It would save us so much time to be able to get the truth across without innocent families having to, sorry, nerves, to justify their actions and prove how innocent they are. We would also like this FII masterclass closed down quickly. It's being taught to paediatricians by the Royal College of Paediatricians. Every time this course is taught, hundreds more families are being accused. We've lost 10 children in the last 2 days. Oh. So we would ask, can we join the support and separation group? And B, can we have support for our families from you guys?
You're very welcome. Can you explain what FII is?
Basically, it used to be called Munchausen by proxy, so it's parents accused of causing their children symptoms, but currently the range runs from over-anxious parents to parents that actually use medication to cause symptoms.
It's fabricated and induced illness.
Fabricated, induced
illness. Thank you. Right. Thank you very much for that. Okay, I don't know. Yes, go ahead, please.
Hello, I'm Jean Robson-Molloy. I've come here to represent the MA campaign. MA is spelled MAA and stands for Movement for an Adoption Apology. This is sounds very unlikely, doesn't it? But an incredible thing sort of happened on the 12th of July. We, thanks to hard work of an MP, Alison McGovern, also one of our members, Anne Keane, and Emma, who supported it, we got a motion debated in Parliament and passed for an adoption apology. Sounds great, but it's really only a start. For one thing, most of the MPs had gone away to when they were tired of talking about Brexit, and they all went out. So there was about 16, I think, something like that, MPs left in the House. Nevertheless, it's a first step. and an apology means nothing if they don't go into what happened. These were women who, I'm one of them, I felt obliged to give up my child because I wasn't married. This was crazy. I was a social worker myself, and I gave myself the wrong advice, and I've lived with the consequences. But a lot of women fought very hard to try and keep their children, and were told, no, it's impossible. Just every child needs two parents, male and female, and single parent is not wrong. And a lot of these women never had any more children. I'm very lucky. I eventually, 10 years later, after having a lot of therapy and getting more confidence, I married a bit of a rascal, but never mind. I had 2 more children who are lovely. Oh, got their problems like anybody else. But what happened at this, I just want to say quickly about this apology. We're hoping to meet the minister. He did say he would meet us and talk about really all the details of things that happened to people. But the rather ironic thing he said towards the end was, well, my heart bleeds, he said in some sort of it was Naheem Howie, who is now the minister, but I think he's sort of downgraded to under-parliamentary something for. So they don't really put a lot of effort into understanding these problems. But he said at the end, oh yeah, you mothers who lost your children in the 50s, 60s, 70s, we're so sorry. But, nowadays, there's no problem. The system is fine. Well, I'm a retired social worker. I know it's not, and you all know it's not. So he's got an awful lot of educating to do, and I'm glad that so many of you are going to do that.
That we're very aware of all the crimes committed by the Labour Party, especially under Tony Blair. Now, and I definitely count on something different happening this time around. If nothing else, because there's a big movement that's pushing for real change, and that can make a big difference as it does in this room today.
Okay, this is a message from the Scottish Kinship Carers, who are a group of mainly grandmothers fighting to keep their grandchildren when their grandchildren are not able to live with their parents. They've been fighting for a national allowance for kinship carers comparable to the amount that foster carers get, and we have to say, if we got the money that are given out to foster families, we wouldn't have, so much difficulty in, making ends meet in our families and keeping things together. Okay, they are also part of the Support Not Separation Coalition. They say kinship care is sadly the second-class option. Families in poverty, domestic abuse and addiction are the 3 major categories of babies being removed after birth in Scotland. This is rising, and social workers are sent in pre-birth to determine the fate of the child before they even arrive into the world. Kinship allows the child to remain within the family unit to nurture the blood ties. There is very rarely now the chap at the door knocking, which is the social work, which used to be commonplace. Now there are lengthy waits in foster care for up to 15 months average, whilst the child's fate is decided and the family face assessments for kinship. There is a care crisis, not even enough carers for the escalating amount of under-8s. We have new incentives for foster carers. They're raising the fees for children over 8 to attract more foster carers, and we still have unpaid, unrecognised kinship carers. Bereaved grandparents are expected to leave the grandchildren where they are or lose the right to both financial and other support, so a bereaved grandparent facing the death of their own child whilst grieving is supposed to not do what comes naturally and protect their grandchildren. Instead, we have to wait on social workers picking up these children and then assessing us. It is a barbaric way to treat any human being. Children should always be given to family first, where that is an option, and mothers should be supported to keep their children until this becomes viable. The term "may be harmed" should not be allowed to be used as a means to remove children unnecessarily from mothers or families. Kinship families feel unsupported and sometimes bullied by the threat, "we will just take them away." Many carers fear that if they speak up or ask for support, this is portrayed as if you are not coping.
Thank you very much. Which I knew already, which is that we have to leave the room at 8 o'clock, and it is now 8 o'clock. So, hold on. Can I just say, we are a coalition. We very much want people to join our coalition if you agree with our aims. The aims are at the back of the room. We have a form for people to fill in, to leave their circumstances, so that we can pull this movement together. There is huge feeling. There are thousands of people all around the country, thousands of mothers and kinship carers who want to put an end to this situation. We owe it to ourselves and to our children and to the society that we want to build, different from the one that we are having to deal with now. We have some support within the Labour Party. I do believe that we do have it this time. And I do believe that our movement can ensure that that support remains and grows, because that is the only way to ever guarantee that politicians will do anything. I'm sure Emma agrees with that because she knows it's true. So please, can people make sure you leave your details and that we know all the organizations that are here today. We also have a picket of the family court on the first Wednesday of every month between 12:30 and 1:30. Take a leaflet. If you're in London, join us. It's very, very effective. If you're somewhere else, start your own. They started in Brighton, and it would be great if we had pickets all around the country. It would have a massive impact on social services and the family courts and how much power they think they have that they can use against us. It could change everything. So please do consider it. We also have a blog which has just been launched, and some information about this meeting will go up there. And we definitely want comments from people so that this movement grows. But we must absolutely stay in touch. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the people who have been campaigning for years and years, like our sister Jean, and for all the new ones who have been forced into campaigning because of our circumstances now. Together we can change the world, and we can certainly change this situation. So thank you.
Sorry, I know you're all rushing to go out. Just to add to the excellent contributions, we're launching a report on 20th September that's highlighting separating families using Prevent. So there's a lot of families. We've actually got 30 cases in our report, but Mark Brownlee, the former counter-terrorism kind of officer, said there's hundreds of families that have gone through it. So what's happening is there's a pseudoscience of Prevent that's being used in family courts. There's secret evidence that's being used to actually separate mothers from their children. And we've been fighting a lot of these cases, so the report is going to come out on the 20th of September. They're available on our website, cage.ngo, but we're having a launch on Saturday the 29th of September. The details are on this flyer. I've left it around in different places, but again, if you go to our website, you'll find it. Thank you very much.